Okay, everyone, can you all hear me? You can let me know in the chat. You can just let me know that you can hear me. Yeah, all good? Good stuff, guys. All right, let's get going straight away. All right. So, again, we're just going to review some exam questions today, and just going to go over the assessment objectives very, very quickly with you, and then we'll talk about how to break down a question, identify the key elements, understand how to structure your answer, and get some example answers in here as well. Right. So, assessment objective that for A-level geography, you've got 3 levels. Generally, if you're doing assessment objective 1, you're trying to remember or demonstrate some understanding of a basic topic. Level 2 answers typically tend to be applying and analyzing, but may include some evaluation element to it. And level 3, which is bringing it all together, will typically be higher order marks, so 12 or 20 mark questions in the exam, and they will be a assessment objective 3 level marks. Remember that command words, assessment objective 1, state, describe, outline, and explain. Whereas level 2, explain, suggest, assess, evaluate, discuss, or to what extent sort of questions, or words to that effect. These tend to be the most common ones that come up. So the first question that we've got is, explain how tension can increase between countries over the acquisition of physical resources such as oil. So just like you to go ahead and just write that question down. Once you've written that down, just let me know in the chat, and then we'll move on to the next section. Okay, good stuff. Let's move on. Okay, so this is how I'd break down the question. You might want to underline similar sort of words, or you might want to way or highlight things. Explain, obviously, immediately I'm thinking a level 2, assessment objective 2 question. Tension, something, okay, there's a conflict going on here that I need to discuss. Increase between countries, so I might want to jot down some examples of countries that I know of. And acquisition of physical resources. Now, it gives me an example, such as oil, but remember, don't get distracted by the oil part. Often what will happen with candidates is they'll look at oil and they'll think, oh, that's what I need to talk about. Actually, that's not what you need to talk about entirely. You might want to talk about other resources too. So underline those things, and just like you to yourself, just annotate on your question very quickly some examples that you can think of. This way it's going to jog your memory a little bit, and you'll get a lot more out of today's session. So without using your book at home, your notes or whatever, see if you can remember some examples of tensions between countries, and think of some different examples besides oil that you may or may not have studied. Just give you guys another 30 seconds. Okay, let's move on. So hopefully you've written down a few points. Now, if I was doing this at home, if I was practicing writing or doing some exam questions and I really struggled with the answers, I'll just break it down and take the time to write an answer. Don't try to rush it. Don't try to just use your textbook and then try to rewrite in your own words off the bat. Just break it down. Create a table like this one. You might want to make a note. I just write down countries that I know of that have got between them, some physical resources being fought over. Now, they could be oil, but there might be some other examples. So in the chat, just let me know what other examples of physical resources that you can think of besides oil. Let's see what you guys can come up with. Just let me know in the chat any physical resources. Yeah, coal is going to be definitely one. Natural gas, very good. Obviously, oil is something that you could talk about. So those are the main ones, right? Good. And then you can write down some tensions that exist. Now, remember, these tensions could be economic. They could be political. They could even be environmental, depending on which example or examples that you choose to talk about. Yes, physical resources include water as well. Yeah, wood, definitely. Land disputes would have to be specific. You'd need to say what are they, what specifically what resource exists there in terms of land. It could be for agriculture, for example, potentially. Yeah, good job. Right, so let's move on to the next slide. So I'd break it down to this and write down a few notes, and that will help you to just structure your answer a little bit better too. Okay, so remember that when you're doing an assessment objective 2 question, you need to explain and present your ideas in logical steps. You need to apply your knowledge and understanding clearly and must address the question through a well-developed and written answer. Now, this means not one giant paragraph, okay, where you just talk about oil the whole time, but you break it down into maybe a few different paragraphs. You might have 2 main paragraphs for a 6-mark question. The first one, you talk about a specific conflict over a specific resource, and then follow that up by a different example in the second paragraph. That's one way that you could logically demonstrate your knowledge. So let's have a look at this answer here. I'd like you to have a read through it very carefully, and then think about, has this answer identified tensions, and have they explained how they increase? So I'll give you guys a minute or so. And once you've had, let me know what you think in the chat box. Okay, so you think there's some good examples of countries and data being used? For those of you just joining us, if we're just having a read this answer, and we're trying to figure out whether they have identified or explained how they increase. Arctic example use, yeah, maybe more detail required. Okay, interesting. Thank you for sharing. Maybe you should mention another physical resource, yeah, potentially. Okay, just give me another 15 seconds and then we're going to break this down and identify where it has and where it could be improved further. Okay, yeah, so it looks like a well-structured answer. Actually, the answer that was given to me was actually just one giant paragraph, and I've split this up just for ease of reading. Okay, so if we break this down, the first sentence, I think it was an okay start. It lost the opportunity to identify which countries are in tension with each other. So it talks about this can be seen in the Arctic, as it is estimated that a quarter of the world's undiscovered oil and natural gas is in the Arctic Ocean. But it's not telling me which countries, right? Even in the first sentence, it's not mentioned, is it Russia? Is it China? Is it the US? Is it Canada? Is it Denmark? Who is it that's having a conflict with each other? It's really important that in your first sentence, you establish your authority over the answer, right? Remember, you're meant to demonstrate your authority, that you really know what you're talking about. And starting a sentence with tensions can increase over physical resources. Yes, I already know that at A level. You're just repeating back to me the question that's been written for you, right? So instead of doing that, just go straight into it and just say, countries such as Russia and Canada are in conflict with each other as seen in the Arctic Ocean. And then say, why is it that they may be at loggerheads over each other? Now, it's really, really important that you do that because it demonstrates your authority over the subject matter. And immediately when the examiner reads that, they know they're not just rereading the question. And it shows to them that, oh, I can learn something from this candidate. Okay? So you try to get yourselves, to think that it's not your teacher marking it, that it's actually somebody that you don't know who knows nothing about geography. You need to teach them this. Now, the second paragraph, there's some little bit of misinformation here, right? So this has made world powers like US, China, and Russia, that's questionable if they are world powers, especially China and Russia, and disputing over where their territory is and boundaries are. Well, that's a bit vague because China is not in dispute with Russia or the United States over these territories, right? Because they don't actually have a landmass that surrounds the area. So immediately, it's showing to me that you don't have authority over the topic that you're talking about, all right? And then it's followed up by another vague sentence, right? So oil and natural gas, there is a huge demand globally, therefore it will bring lots of money to countries, allowing further economic growth. I'm not sure what point is trying to be made here, okay? Also, whoever eventually gains the biggest area in the Arctic will show they have more power. Again, this is a very vague description that's being written here, not really answering a question that's going on to previously. And then finally, I'm not sure with this paragraph, in the final paragraph, developing countries need the money that developed nations give them for their resources. Well, actually, it's not them giving it to them for resources, they're actually buying it. So it's actually a global trade network that exists. And again, talking about countries as if they are companies is a misunderstanding of the situation, but also in this particular case, definitely the question. Okay, so this is kind of a vague couple of lines to end the answer with. So overall, it may seem like from a student's perspective that it's really well written and really well structured, but actually the depth of the answer isn't really there, and it's not referring to what's being asked for. Is that clear? If you can just let me know in the chat if that makes sense. Okay, good stuff. All right. Perfect. I really hope this is helping you guys out, because often what will happen with students is they tend to write these answers and they think in their minds that they're writing really good pieces of work, but you know, they're just kind of making some stuff up as they're going along. So always just make sure that you take the time, you know, when you're doing exam questions for practice, use your textbook, use your notes to help you to write really good answers. Right, so here's a different answer. Again, I've split this up into its different components so that it's clearer for you and easier for you to read. And we will go through what you think of it. So for those of you who just arrived, if you just have a read of the sample answer, and we will go through breaking it down and what we think, what kind of mark this would get. Just let me know once you've had a read and once you've got an idea what's going on. Okay, good understanding, but needs more explanation. Okay, doesn't really talk about the tensions. Interesting, okay. Belinda, if you've got any specific questions or topics that you'd like us to cover, just let me know in the chat. Okay, so let's go through this answer then. Let's break it down. Again, like I said, I've broken this down into separate sections. The answer was actually amalgamated into one giant paragraph. Okay, so the first sentence, tensions can arise over the acquisition of physical resources. That's an okay start, right? But it could be improved by identifying or clarifying what tensions actually are, right? What does it look like? What would I see? What would I feel? What can I visually sense when it comes to attention? Okay, that's really, really important to identify. The second sentence, the main resources that are disputed are oil, gas, and precious metals. Okay, now that's much better. So it's establishing some examples of physical resources that could potentially be answered in the question. Tensions rise where ownership is disputed and disagreement exists. Okay, for example, the tug of war over land in the Arctic. Now that's a really succinct description. Tug of war, great use of terminology there. However, it just needed an example added at the end. So for example, it could have said, such as Canada and Russia having a disagreement over, how far their landmass extends into the Arctic, right? So that would have just been a perfect paragraph to end that point. The third sentence, much longer. So superpowers and emerging powers need physical resources. It would have been nice perhaps to just put in brackets USA and then emerging powers perhaps put China. Needs physical resources. Some have these domestically in many cases. they must be obtained through international trade. Okay, so making a valid point. If the price for a barrel of oil is too high, countries may head to new territory where it would be more economically efficient to extract the oil themselves or buy it. Well, I don't know of any examples where countries can, I mean, we have, I think, pretty much all the planet except for Antarctica and Arctic are regions where territory is, even their territory is divided. So it's not a case of a country just turning up somewhere and then just extracting oil wherever it wants. So it's a little bit confused there. For example, the price per barrel of oil was $120 in 2011, causing massive costs for non-producing oil-producing governments. Okay. Now, the first line and the third paragraph makes a valid point, which is then elaborated with a second example, and then tries to tie it in with a further elaborated example. And it would have been better, instead of just talking generically about things, to specifically talk about X or Y country in this context. Because what that would do is demonstrate your authority. It shows that you know examples, you know specific examples, and then you're saying, here, look, examiner, I know what I'm talking about. This is what's happening between Russia and Canada. China is trying to get in on it too. And the way that they're trying to do that is by doing this, this, and this. And therefore, there is increasing conflict between X country and Y country. That's all you need to do here. Instead of talking about vague kind of generalizations, which may have happened in the past, and if you want to talk about those are fine, but then give some evidence for them too. All right? Okay, good stuff. Let's move on to the next example here. So have a read of this one, guys. So sample answer 3. And then we'll go through the answer together and establish what is going well and what's not going so well in this question. Again, so this answer was written as a whole, again in one paragraph. And what I want you to get into the habit of is just try to just create a gap between each point that you're trying to make, right? So just start off with a sentence, give yourself that sentence break, and then write the second paragraph. Having that just slight break in between will help you to just gather your thoughts, but also see it from a different perspective. And just let me know once you've got that down in the chat. I'll do my best, Belinda. Okay, just another 10, 15 seconds, just have a read through the answer. Just think about what we've talked about earlier and just let me know in the chat. Tell me what could be improved. You might want to write down first sentence, this is good, or second sentence, second paragraph, this could be improved, or third paragraph, I think this person should have done this. Just let me know in the chat what you think or how you think this person could improve their answer. So if you guys just let me know in the chat, guys. Pick out a sentence or pick out a paragraph, specific one. Let me know what you think about it or how do you think you could improve it. Okay, yeah, so first sentence is good, but look into a specific case study or a specific country. But other than that, it's a good answer, okay? Tom, I'm going to need a little bit more from you. Simple dash is not really good feedback. Talk about other things than oil, potentially. Okay, Spencer, you think it's a great answer? All right. Let's go through it in a minute. Anyone else want to chip in? Just a brief thought, maybe about a specific paragraph or a sentence. Yeah, explain how the planting of the flag could increase tension. Yeah, potentially. Yeah, okay, so the first sentence, it identifies an example with a dispute. So clearly there is a dispute in the Arctic Circle. Even better would have been, as mentioned in the chat, give an example, who's the major dispute between? Canada and Russia are the obvious ones here, right? Now, this candidate then goes on to talk about it in the second paragraph. So it makes up for the fact that it hasn't mentioned it in the first one, okay? Now, the good thing about the second paragraph is that it talks about how the conflict can arise, right? Because they've got disputing claims over the extent to which their continental shelf extends, right? That's clearly identifying how the tensions can increase between them. As such, disputes potentially may arise over how much physical resources, such as oil and gas, they legally have claim to. Now, not only has the candidate then mentioned that the dispute is over landmass, but then talks about the fact that, how much oil and gas potentially the dispute will be over in the future. So that's a really good kind of development of that point. So the third sentence builds on how the situation could potentially get worse than it already is, right? Because remember, we're talking about tensions can increase over time, right? The final paragraph here, despite the claims from each side, so look how it's kind of saying, look, it's a way of demonstrating that there is a conflict between two sides, right? This has not been resolved diplomatically yet, right? So again, showing how tensions can increase, potentially creating conditions for misunderstandings between both nations, right? So each point along that sentence is saying how it can increase, how the situation can get worse, right? Russia's activities, such as planting of a flag on the Lomonosov Ridge, along with its increasing militarization of its northern shores, has created greater political tension. So mentioning the type of tension that's occurring and could potentially lead to quote unquote hot conflict, i.e. a physical conflict in the future with competing nations in the region. It established an example of something that happened that the Russians did. Even better would be to mention a date or a time that it happened, and perhaps talk about, if you wanted to go further, maybe talk about when the militarization started. So the Russians have been on it for at least 15 to 16 years in the northern shores and could potentially lead to hot conflict. So you could have mentioned maybe a specific example of militarization. For example, now Russia can land its fighter jets in these extremely cold environments, which the Americans definitely can't do. And the Canadians, I don't think, have an air force that could match or have enough firepower in comparison to the Russians. But with that aside, it's showing, this particular paragraph is showing evidence of potential conflicts to increase because of the activities of one, or potentially you could answer, in your answer, you could put two countries, and what the activities they're doing that's creating or stoking future disputes in the world ahead, right? Yeah, absolutely. You could mention something about icebreakers and the fact that Russia has, I think, 10 or 15, I can't remember the exact number, nuclear-powered icebreakers that could create potential conflicts because the Americans, I believe, only have one. I don't think there is any other nation on earth that has any icebreakers. Maybe China has maybe one, perhaps. And there's a dispute between Russia and China over the use of icebreakers because Russia is demanding that any country that is sending its cargo through its territorial waters gets escorted by Russian ships. So again, that could be a potential conflict between China and Russia that you could have mentioned, and potentially Iceland as well, right? So these are examples that you can mention. Again, this is just an example of how you could structure your answer well, but this is not the only way of doing it, right? So my suggestion is that you sit down, write the question out. You've got a template here to follow, and go back through your notes, go back through your case study examples, go back through your textbook, whatever you're using, and then this would probably end up getting a high level 2 mark, so probably 5 or 6. What you've also got to remember is that in the exam, you've got a very short period of time, right? So if you end up writing something like this, you're probably definitely going to get 4 marks or just close enough to 4 marks. But remember, the more you practice writing, okay, the better you're going to get. So my suggestion would be, look at that answer and try to rewrite it in your own way. Rewrite it in your own method, maybe use different adjectives, maybe use different examples, and see if you can construct a similar answer. Okay, so now we're going to move on to looking at a tectonics answer, and we're going to look at the vulnerability to tectonic hazards has risen over time. How far do you agree with this statement? I'm just going to give you 30 seconds or so just to quickly jot down your answer, question, not the answer, write down the question, and then we'll go through this together. If you guys can let me know once you've written it down in the chat box, and we will go through it together. Okay, Spencer's ready to go. Okay, let's get going. So first thing, remember, always underline key things which stick out for you, all right? And then that way you can start thinking about how you're going to structure your answer. Make your annotations above and below the question. So here I've highlighted vulnerability in the context of physical geography. I should get that changed. That should say tectonic hazards. There we go. So vulnerability to tectonic hazards. So maybe you might want to highlight very quickly tectonic hazards, which ones you can think of. And I'd underline the word time. Now remember, at A level, they're going to ask you temporal questions or spatial questions. Okay, or they might mix in both spatial and temporal into the question itself. Particularly for shaping places, there will be questions which will require you to have an understanding of the spatial characteristics of something and how temporally, how by time things have changed over a long period of time. So what I'd like you to do is just write down in your own answer in front of you, your own question, just annotate the question itself. And then we'll start going through breaking down this question. Just very quickly, just 30 seconds, just write down some examples of tectonic hazards. Maybe write down what you think vulnerability means, or if you've got an example of a specific thing that you've learned about vulnerability at A level. And then maybe summarize the word, how far do you agree, into one word. What do you think that word could be? And just give me a thumbs up, or just let me know in the chat that you've done that. You made a few notes. It's really, this will help you to start thinking about things and get you engaged with the material rather than just passively listening. Just let me know when you've got your annotations on. Okay, good job. Right, let's get going. So remember, again, when you're revising at home or you're revising for an exam, mock exams, whatever they might be, make a little template, right? So then you can come back to these and revise from them afterwards. I'd write down the tectonic hazards that I'm aware of. I'd write down very quickly some examples that I've studied. Again, if you don't know them, you don't remember them, don't just sit there, trying to worrying about remembering them. Get your textbook out, write them down, find the right page, get your notes out and write them down. And then write down the vulnerability level. Is it low, medium, high, extreme? What is the vulnerability level of this particular case study example in context of the tectonic hazard you might have chosen? So for example, it might be Mount Pinatubo as your case study, Philippines, and the vulnerability level would probably be high, moderate, or high. And has this increase or decrease over time? You can say temporally, the date range is probably about 500 years. Every 500 years, the volcano erupts. So that's, in human time period, it's moderate. It's not very long, it's pretty moderate. Okay, so I'd just like you to make a note of those columns. And then once you've made it, then you've got that reference point you can come back to, and then afterwards you can come and rewrite your answer for this question. Yeah, of course, you can mention Haiti for sure. Yeah, definitely. Haiti would be a good one. Haiti's, yeah, I mean, in terms of vulnerabilities, extremely vulnerable. Okay, just another 15, 20 seconds. Just get down those 4 columns very, very quickly, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so let's move on. So again, remember, you must explain in logical steps, apply your knowledge and understanding clearly, and have a well-structured and well-developed answer. So remember from the previous question that we did, we broke the question down into little chunks, wrote the answer down in little chunks as we went along the way, right? So make sure that you're doing the same thing, all right? Just break it down. And that way you'll feel like you're writing the right things and the relevant things in your answer. So let's have a look at this answer, have a read through, and you guys can tell me where this candidate has done well or not done well. And just let me know your thoughts in the chat box. Okay, thanks, Spencer. Perhaps not long enough for a 12 marker potentially. That aside, are there any particular points that you think are good, or break it down like I did for the previous question? Think about the first sentence. Has it hit the nail on the head? Has it established what the rest of the answer is going to talk about? Has it talked about, then built on that and elaborated on it in the following sentences? Okay, so didn't really acknowledge the temporal aspect of the question. Okay, simply described an evident event showing good depth of knowledge, but not much else. Interesting. Okay, let's have a couple of more people make their suggestions. Could you give an example potentially? Give you guys another 30 seconds and then we'll go through this together. Barely any evaluation hasn't talked about the development of Japan in terms of infrastructure and education. Yes. Yeah, really good point. Really, really good point. Well picked out, Spencer. Okay, so let's break this down, guys. Let's go through it together. So here's the bits that I've highlighted. Okay, so the first sentence, I agreed to a large extent that vulnerability to technology hazards has risen over time. Okay, well, immediately I'm thinking, well, do I really need to read the rest of the answer because you've already made a decision, right? Remember, you're demonstrating to the examiner, you're scaffolding the information, which will eventually lead to that outcome, right? You don't start with the outcome and then work your way backwards, right? So don't start with answering the question. I would suggest starting with the definition of vulnerability. What does vulnerability mean? Why, what's the importance of that word? There's lots of things that you've studied, right? Particularly when it comes to vulnerability. Establish those key things. Now, an appropriate example has been chosen, and a couple of you have already mentioned that, right? But there's clearly a clear lack of understanding of the actual impacts, right? So it talks about lots of different things. So vulnerability is increased due to high risk of buildings collapsing and crater damage costs. Okay, but what are the actual damage? What are the actual buildings that collapse? Or what were what was the total cost of the collapse of that in Tokyo, right? And actually, the answer is very vague and demonstrates a lack of understanding about the protocols, all the protocols and measures Japan as a nation has taken to reduce vulnerability over a very long period of time. Now, if you went back 100 years, back in 1920, if this earthquake had happened, certainly a lot of Japan would have been wiped out because most of the buildings were made out of wood, right? But today, that is certainly not the case. And they're one of the most engineered cities. They have the most engineered cities. They have the most understanding. They have protocols in place. Every year they have a drill, earthquake drill day, where there's mock events that happen. Schools are involved, hospitals are involved, other organizations are involved. Everyone does a mock run of what happens in an earthquake. So people are aware. They know what's going to happen, right? That's a way that they've taught their nation, they've educated the nation to reduce vulnerability in that place. So why hasn't that been mentioned in the answer, right? Give some examples of how that happened. Now, with Tohoku in particular, that was in the north of the island, quite far away from Tokyo. And in this answer, nowhere is it mentioned about the vulnerability of nuclear power, right? That's where there was almost nuclear meltdown with the power plants at Fukushima. Now, why has that not been talked about in the answer? That's extreme vulnerability. It doesn't make sense to have nuclear power stations right next to or close to a tectonic plate boundary, right? Now, you could mention that they had taken measures into account to reduce vulnerability, but at the same time, those measures weren't enough, and go into depth explaining how that happened, right? So again, a lot of vague generalizations being established in this answer, chucking in names of cities because assumption is that the person who's going to be reading it is just going to assume that that's truthful. Vagueness in the answer throughout. It undermines you as a writer because you know the answers well enough. Just clearly plan out what you're going to write. And if you're doing this at home, get your textbook out. Make sure that what you're writing makes sense, because the last thing you need to do at A-level is demonstrate a superficial understanding of the case studies that you've studied. The assumption will be at A-level that you really know your case studies, you understand what happened, and you understand the issues that have been involved in it. Okay? So remember, don't be careless in your writing. Be specific. All right? Okay, let's move on to a new example. Have a read of this one, and then we'll go through this together. Okay, so in the chat, just tell me, has this answer defined vulnerability? Have they chosen appropriate examples? Have they referred to temporal changes? Okay, so no case study given. Yeah, that's right. No example is actually given in this answer. Anything else? Just a couple of more points, guys, and then we're going to move on to the next slide and talk through how we can improve our answer. Yeah, very good. Yeah, good stuff, Jamin. Yeah, so no use, again, of temporal changes or solutions, okay? There's no case study, so we can't even understand, what's going on. So immediately you're thinking it's a 12-mark question, and not to give an example is, it's terrible, right? You're not going to get very far in the mark scheme, right? You've got to ground it in a specific example to help demonstrate your understanding of the idea, right? Good. Again, yeah, well done, Spencer, for picking out that this straight away judgment, right? To a small extent, I disagree because of the solutions people have found to reduce vulnerability, right? So again, don't start with that. Start with talking about what vulnerability is. What is the definition of vulnerability, right? Then maybe ground that in a particular case study. Now, whether it's Haiti that you decide to choose, whether it's Pinatubo, whether it's the Tohoku earthquake, it could be Nepal, New Zealand, whatever it is, just make sure that you know the key facts and what's involved. Why is it that that particular place was able to reduce its vulnerability, or the vulnerability was increased? Obviously, if it's a developing country, the vulnerability will be increased. If it was a developed country, generally they would have decreased it. But at no point has any country been able to eradicate vulnerability, right? And that's something that you could mention in a evaluation style question here, because it says, how far do you agree with the statement? Because in your conclusion, you could say, overall, the biggest challenge with tectonic events is that they are not possible to predict. We can guesstimate, we can try to make some estimates on when we think maybe an earthquake may happen, but we don't know when is something going to happen, regardless of how developed or undeveloped a country might be. Okay, so let's move on. Now, if I was going to break down this question, if I was answering this question, here are the key things that I would have identified, right? And you might want to make a note of these. Obviously, you can come back to watch the video later and review this in your own time at a slower pace if you need to. So definition, right? Vulnerability is the measure of the extent to which a community, structure, service, or geographical area is likely to be damaged or disrupted, right? Words to that effect established at the beginning, very important, right? So you may put that in the context of a case study that you are going to go on to talk about. Okay. So you could say something like vulnerability in the context of a developed country such as Japan. You will find that vulnerability is to a certain extent reduced because of actions taken by the government itself or the nation. Okay. And then, or maybe you want to compare it and say, well, in Haiti, this is the opposite case. Now, there are three main elements of how far a country is vulnerable. Okay, so these are really important. And actually, for this answer of a 12 marker, I think it's critical that you mention the PAR model. Okay, if you don't mention it, I think it's kind of like missing out on what the question is really asking you. All right, so you've got to talk about the root causes of something, the dynamic pressures, and the unsafe conditions, and the type of natural hazard. The type of natural hazard, regardless of whether it's a volcanic eruption, an earthquake, whatever it is, the impacts of it will be variable depending on the root causes of the vulnerability of the nation. So in the Haiti's case, they don't even have a government, right? So if they don't have a government, they don't have any systems in place. There's no evacuation plan. There's no education of the people that are living there. People are not aware of building practices, right? And that adds to the pressures and adds to the unsafe conditions in which people find themselves in. Okay, now I've summarized this in this basic table below. You've got developed nations such as New Zealand, Japan, Chile, for example. They've got high technology, they've got great use of technology, and they've got good governance. Now, these two things are going to be critical to answer. You've got to talk about technology and you've got to talk about governance. That's how vulnerability can be reduced. Or if you're going to talk about developing country, then you would talk about how the fact that they have low-level technology and they have poor or no governance in place. Now, the extent to which a country is vulnerable depends on whether it's developed or is developing. Okay, so use comparable tectonic events to explain the vulnerability has or has not arisen over time. So there's a temporal aspect to this question which you must address, right? So it might be a country such as Chile. If you went back 50 years, if they had an earthquake, maybe thousands of people died. But more recently, even if they had an 8.1 on a Richter scale, which I think they did a few years ago, I think a handful of people died, right? So that shows you how over time they've put measures in place to reduce vulnerability. And then you could talk about things, measures that they've taken to do that. Whereas with Haiti, it started off being an underdeveloped nation, but actually over time, the situation's got a lot worse, right? And then you can explain those processes that are involved. Now, is that helpful? If you just let me know in the chat if that makes sense, and otherwise I'm just kind of talking to myself. Okay, good. So now start thinking about how you're going to go ahead and answer this question. I'm going to give you another example of an answer. So let's have a look at this one here. So again, I've broken this up into little parts. And again, what I've done here, I've just said opening paragraph, make sure you define what vulnerability is in the context of the question. Okay. Now have a read of the rest of this answer. Let me know your thoughts and let me know how you think this will be improved. What paragraph should follow the Haiti one? Okay. And how would you start your conclusion? Okay, so let me know your thoughts about the first two lines. Give you another 30 seconds. Yeah, that's right. So the first two lines basically showing the examiner, hey, look, this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about governance. I'm going to talk about access to resources. I think these are the components which show whether a country is vulnerable or less vulnerable to a tectonic event. Yeah, you're acknowledging the question. That's right. So the main paragraph, what would you do? Would you change it? If not, tell me what you would write for conclusion. How would you start your conclusion? What's the difference between acknowledging the question and using the words of the question? You could do it either way. You could use the words from the question itself. Okay, it's just 30 more seconds. If you can just type in what your thoughts are, and then we'll get things wrapped up for today. Yeah, could be improved by giving an opinion, perhaps. Yeah, so that could go in the conclusion, right? So at the end, you could say, to a large extent, okay, in the final paragraph, you may want to write, to a large extent, I believe, or from the evidence given, it appears to be the fact that vulnerability is X or Y, right? So again, you can use the words from the question, just like the previous answers that started with to a large extent, to a small extent. You can just copy and paste that and have that right at the end, and then go back and refer to access to resources or economic development. And what you're doing is you're putting placeholders for the examiner to look at and just go, okay, that's where I want you to give me the marks, right? And there is a logical progress through the answer, which has covered those key points, and then goes back to the original question and reestablishes that at the end. Okay? Okay, guys, so remember, you've got to practice writing. Like, it's not going to come naturally, like just amazingly, just suddenly just appear on a page, right? Good answers require plenty of hours of writing in your own words consistently over time. And you've got plenty of time between now and the summer, the final exam. You've got plenty of time to be practicing as often as possible. For short answer questions, you need to look around about 100 words or so. Remember to read newspaper articles and learn how journalists write. Just try to copy and paste the style in which they're writing. Remember to use words such as, particularly for 6-mark questions, because, despite, some, but, these words should be running off the top of your answers, right? So before going into an exam or a test that you might be doing, you might just want to write these down in the front so that you've got them noted somewhere, and then you can come back to it and then check your answer and go, okay, well, did I use despite or some or but or because? Write in the third person. Try to make sure that you are talking about the most critical factor. Write as if the person reading your answer gets a sense of who you are and you're writing with authority, and make sure that you write clearly and neatly. So 2 questions that we covered today, superpowers and tectonics. My suggestion would be to go away now and write your answer again. If you've already done this question, do it again. If you're first time seeing it, then attempt doing the question. Review the video, carefully go through little bits again. And next week, we'll look at the superpowers example, and we will do a short answer question review as well on shaping places. Right, any questions? Give you guys 30 seconds, let me know. Okay, cool, no problem. Well, there's still quite a few people here, so if you guys have got any questions, let me know, and then we'll wrap up. You're welcome, Andrew. Okay, everyone. Well, I'm going to call it an evening. Hopefully you've enjoyed it and you've taken something away from it. Please make sure that you review anything that you've missed, recap it. Remember to keep practice writing your answers. The more you practice, the better you're going to get. And over the next however many months, if you keep doing this, you will definitely 100% get better. Right, I'll see you all soon.